I want to invite you tonight to open up to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. We read the verses already this evening, Austin did, and we will be looking at that section in our study tonight. You know, one thing I've always enjoyed is geography. I like to look at maps. Back before we had them on phones and iPads and stuff, I would just break out the big Rand McNally every now and then and just open up and just look at, what was where. And I've also always found it interesting, the notable people who come from a particular place, whether they were born there or maybe just lived a significant portion of their life there. If you look up different cities on the Wikipedia website, you'll almost always find a list of people who are from whatever city you look up. I looked up Deer Park, Texas, and I was shocked to find that I was not on that list. You got people like Andy Pettit who, pitched for the Yankees and folks like that, but I was nowhere to be found. People are frequently proud to point out the famous people who come from their hometown. And we sometimes go so far as to honor notable people in some way. And that's how you end up with the Babe Zaharias golf course on Jimmy Johnson Boulevard, like around here. I mean, that's where you get that kind of thing. You get notable people that are acknowledged in some way from a particular area. Well, I looked to see if there was a Wikipedia entry for the city of Nazareth. And turns out there is one. It's not altogether surprising that it mentions the most famous person to ever come from there. It points out that Nazareth, quote, is described in the New Testament as the childhood home of Jesus. And even after he made his home in Capernaum, around the time that he began his public ministry, he was still known as Jesus of Nazareth. He is referred to that way by people. He is referred to that way by demons. He was referred to that way by angels. And if you read through the Gospels, you'll find each of those. In fact, when he was crucified in John chapter 19 and verse 19, the inscription on the cross said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. I want you to think for a moment about how the people of Nazareth must have felt about Jesus. And really, we don't have to do a whole lot of imagining because the scriptures tell us how they felt about Jesus. Before we look at, the verses here in Mark chapter 6, let me give you a little bit of a background leading up to Jesus arriving in Nazareth in the passage that we're going to look at. We're reading through the Gospel of Mark. By this point, we would have read some very interesting events. We would have read about Jesus calming a storm on the Sea of Galilee. We would have read about him casting a legion of demons out of a man. We would have read about him healing a woman who had been sick for 12 years. And perhaps most remarkable of all, we would have read about him raising a girl from the dead. He had done a lot of remarkable things by the time he shows up to Nazareth in Mark chapter 6. And I'll just tell you, if Mark was writing to convince people that Jesus is the Son of God, I think he did a pretty good job of doing that. I mean, he just laid out some facts that really you can't possibly draw another conclusion from them. And so he recorded many of the miracles of Jesus, and even those that he recorded are few in number compared to the number of miracles that Jesus actually did. But the portion of the Gospel of Mark that we're going to look at this evening has to do with an occasion when Jesus could do no miracles, or at least not very many. People were often amazed by Jesus, and we see that here in this account in Mark chapter 6. The people are amazed by him. But what's interesting about this passage in Mark chapter 6 is that Jesus was also amazed by the people. That didn't happen very often, at least not that we're told about, but it did happen on this occasion. And I want us to go ahead and read, it's only 6 verses. I want us to read through these verses again, just kind of with all of that in mind. Where it says in verse 1, he went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished or amazed, saying, where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled, or was amazed, because of their unbelief. That's the way a number of translations put it. He was amazed at their unbelief. He was amazed at their lack of faith, a different translation says. This wasn't the first time that Jesus had actually come back to his hometown. Take just a minute to go over to Luke chapter 4. Earlier I put little markers in my Bible where I'm going to turn to, and I kept wanting to put it in Mark chapter 4, and I was reading the verse, I'm like, this is just not reading the way. It's because I'm in the wrong book. Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, I want you to begin reading with me. Luke records this earlier visit for us. Excuse me. In Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, and he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.' And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" And I'll just tell you, it didn't take him very long to wear out his welcome on that occasion. You go down a few verses, down to verse 29, and we're told that they rose up and they drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff. As we would say in our day, that escalated quickly. That doesn't sound like they're planning to name a golf course after Jesus, or a street or a park or something like that. They're about to put him to death. And if that was me, that's about all I would need to convince me that I don't want to go back there again. But not Jesus. He went back to Nazareth. He was the most famous person to come from that town. And news of his miracles was being circulated everywhere. People traveled miles just to hear him teach at this point. And when he walked into Nazareth this time, in Mark chapter 6, he was followed by disciples. They weren't with him the first time. And you might expect a different reception this time, but we're told, again, in Mark 6 and verse 3, they took offense at him. And that word that's translated offense in this passage is the word from which we get our English word scandal. They thought it was scandalous for Jesus to return to Nazareth as a teacher. That's what it meant to be followed by disciples. Well, how do you account for that? Have you ever wondered why they reacted that way? Why so strongly? It's interesting to me, although the people of Nazareth give one reason for their reaction to Jesus, Mark actually gives us the real reason for their response. The people of Nazareth seem to have been saying that the problem with Jesus was really a lack of credentials. In other words, he didn't fit their preconceived ideas about what a teacher ought to be. You know, they had it figured out in their mind, and Jesus didn't fit that. And they admitted that Jesus had incredible wisdom. They recognized his power, and they didn't know where he got all of that. Again, in verse 2, where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? You know, wonder where he could have gotten all that. But they were pretty sure it didn't have anything to do with Nazareth. And I think they were asking the right questions there, but they just didn't have the right motive. They couldn't deny his wisdom or his power, but they had prejudices that ruled out the possibility of attributing either his wisdom or his works to a divine source. And after all, as they would say there in verse 3, this was the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. We know this guy. We know his people. His sisters live among us still, Mark tells us. And maybe they're just betraying their own opinion of their hometown. Their words seem to indicate that they had the same view of Nazareth that other people did. You remember in John chapter 1 and verse 46, Nathanael asked the question, can Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That just seems to have been the prevailing opinion of that area. And they may have been saying here, we know that Nazareth is nothing special. We live here. We know that the family of Jesus, and really they're not special. And we're pretty convinced that he's not anything special either. What's going on here? And they referred to him as, when they came the first time, in Luke chapter 4 and verse 22, they had referred to him as Joseph's son. But this time, in Mark 6 and verse 3, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and so on down the line. I've heard that at that time in that place, you didn't call a man by his mother's name, not even if his father was dead, did you do that. It was an insult. I don't know why it was an insult, but that's what it was. And I'm not sure why they did that. Maybe they were bringing up the question of his birth or something like that. Maybe there were some questions about that in the minds of some people. But what's interesting about all of this is that those who thought they knew Jesus the best, they were really the ones who were most oblivious about his identity. The people of Nazareth were pretty sure they had Jesus figured out, but the truth is they didn't have a clue. You ever notice that the people who knew Jesus all along seem to have had the most trouble believing in him? His brothers didn't believe in him for a period of time. When they looked at Jesus, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people of Nazareth just saw a young man that they watched grow up. He would have been just a little more than 30 years old at this point, so he was still a young man. Perhaps some of them had done business with him when he worked as a carpenter, and they saw him drink from the same wells that they drank from and ate the same food that they ate, and so on. He wasn't really any different as far as they could tell. That was a problem for them. They had a hard time seeing him as anything other than a regular person, no matter what he did, no matter the kind of wisdom or the great works. You think that might have given them a clue, but it didn't. And so they seem to have had a hard time seeing Jesus as anything other than just a man. And I think we sometimes have the opposite problem of that. We sometimes have a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Jesus really was a man. More than that, but that too. Too many people think of Jesus as someone who, walked about 6 inches off the ground and had a halo around his head so that you could spot him from a mile away when he was coming. He was heads and shoulders taller and way better looking. And that's not really the picture we see in Scripture. It's difficult for us to think of him as just, as a human being, not just a human being, but a human being. And what I think we need to recognize is that his humanity gives us even more reason to love and to appreciate him. In the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, the writer of Hebrews would say this. He'd say, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." That stems from the humanity of Jesus there. And so to the people of Nazareth, Jesus was too much like them. He walks like us. He talks like us. He didn't have the right credentials. But Mark tells us that their real problem was this. It's the lack of faith. One translation says in verse 6, he was surprised that the people did not have any faith. You ever notice that Jesus was never amazed by his own miracles? He was never amazed or stunned by the things that he did, as though you raised somebody from the dead and thought, wow, I didn't know that was going to work, or something along those lines. It's not how it was. Jesus knew who he was and where his strength and his power came from. And it's as if these things were just completely normal events. And it was. He's the one that created the world, as we've talked about here in the recent past. But what did amaze Jesus was the lack of faith in these people who had perhaps known him most of his life, maybe all of his life. He was amazed at the conclusions that their thinking had led them to. And of course, the people of Nazareth were right in not ascribing the wisdom of Jesus or the power of Jesus to anything associated with their town. They knew he didn't get all of that in Nazareth, but they were wrong in that they failed to attribute his wisdom and his miracles to a divine source. They stumbled at the thought that he could have actually been from God. And they could only accept what came through the prescribed channels, the orthodox way of doing things. And so they knew that God could be found in the temple. Go to Jerusalem and you can find God in the temple. They couldn't conceive of finding him in Nazareth, of all places. And certainly not in someone who used to occupy the carpenter's shop of all things. And so the problem with the Nazarenes was that they couldn't accept the claims that were implied by the facts. The facts were that Jesus had great wisdom and he had powerful works. And what was implied by that, at the very least, is that Jesus was a teacher come from God. If you remember, that's the conclusion that Nicodemus had reached. Back in John chapter 3 and verse 2, he would say to Jesus, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." We've connected all the dots, and what we've come up with is that you're a teacher come from God. But for these people to have acknowledged those implications would have meant they're then obligated to follow Jesus, to listen to him. And they weren't about to do that. You ever notice the reaction of people to Jesus is a constant source of amazement? You just can't predict how people are going to react to him. And from what is said by Mark, it looks like Jesus himself didn't always know. Again, he's amazed by their reaction here. And it doesn't seem that he was amazed very often. But we're told that he was amazed on at least a couple of different occasions. Once in our passage and once in another passage. And I want to take just a minute to look at that other passage, if you will. It's found in Luke chapter 7. And it's going to take us just a moment to read through it, but we're going to start in verse 1. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum, it says. Luke 7, verse 1. And now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built for us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. And when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I do not presume to come to you, or did not presume to come to you, but say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. Again, he was amazed. And turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. Have I found such faith?" And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. When I read this passage, it seems to me that this man probably had never met Jesus. He hadn't seen him perform a miracle or heard him teach personally. Based on what he had heard about Jesus, he was convinced that the only thing he had to do was say the word, and that was exactly what was going to happen. His servant was going to be healed. And this centurion had the one thing that the people of Nazareth did not, and that is an amazing, an astonishing, a marvelous faith. The people of Nazareth had known Jesus for years, and they had not only heard him teach in their synagogue, but also seen him perform miracles and as well. But the only thing amazing about them was their lack of faith. They took offense by what Jesus did. And the result, in Mark 6 and verse 5, we're told, is that Jesus could do no mighty works there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. When you read Matthew's account of this story, Matthew says in Matthew 13 and verse 58 that Jesus did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. And the point was not that he couldn't do miracles. The point is that he chose not to do miracles under circumstances like that. For one thing, there apparently weren't very many people in Nazareth who were humble enough to go to him for help. People had to seek that out. And I'm confident that there were many people with problems in the city of Nazareth who could have been helped by Jesus. And the people of the town knew that he was capable of working miracles. But evidently not many of them were willing to go to him, too proud to do that. But another reason why Jesus didn't do many miracles was because he consistently chose not to exercise his power in a climate of unbelief, and that's what it was. It's interesting to note that miracles never did convince anybody who didn't want to believe. They just didn't do that. You ever noticed that in the Gospels? Do you remember what happened, or really in the Bible as a whole, do you remember what happened with Pharaoh when Moses performed miracle after miracle, and the only thing accomplished was what? The hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And the reason is because Pharaoh didn't want to accept what went along with those miracles. If I accept this, then this follows. And he didn't want to let the children of Israel go. And I think that's similar to what we have here. Jesus could drive out demons and heal the sick, but he couldn't help the people of his own hometown because they wouldn't accept his help. They didn't like what went along with accepting the help of Jesus. It meant that they had to listen to him, and they weren't willing to do that. And so what I want us to do with the time we have left this evening is quickly notice a couple of principles that I think we can learn from this passage. There are at least two important principles that we find here that we need to learn. And the first of those that I want you to see is that we can know all about Jesus and not really know him. That's pretty sobering, but it's true. We can know all about Jesus and not really know him. Knowing a lot about Jesus doesn't mean that we really do know him. You see, Jesus is more than the sum total of the information that we can gather about him. And so the Nazarenes thought they knew enough about him simply because they knew his family, and, we got all that kind of figured out, but they didn't. But let me ask you this. Are people today sometimes convinced they know him because they've studied what has been said about him or heard lessons that were preached about him? There's no doubt about that. Yes, we know Jesus. And what I want us to see is that simply being able to recall facts, that's not really the issue when it comes to knowing Jesus. And we need to keep that in mind as we study his life. And it doesn't really matter if we know that Jesus fed 5,000 people by the Sea of Galilee with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish if we don't understand what he said the next day. John 6, verse 35, I am the bread of life, Jesus said. That's what he was trying to point out to these people. And they'd missed that. Many people today missed that. That's the point John was trying to get across by recording that event for us. It doesn't matter how many facts we might be able to recite about the day the disciples picked grain as they walked through the fields if we don't come to understand what Jesus meant in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 8 when he said the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's great for people to take time to learn more about Jesus. But the truth is we have to deal with the claims that are implied by the facts that we read. And there's a lot more to knowing Jesus than just recalling the details of his life. We have to come to terms with what those things mean, their significance, what they mean for our lives. But second, I want you to see that the real problem that people have with Jesus is not a lack of evidence. That's not it. It's a lack of faith. The problem is that people can't believe the evidence. It's often that people won't. And that's why you can have two people who get exposed to the very same message, with the same opportunities, and then they go with it in two entirely different directions. The people sometimes that we think will respond to the gospel don't. And they won't because the very thing we're talking about. You would have thought the people in Nazareth would have been like, here comes Jesus. He's going to teach us again. That's fantastic. That wasn't how they viewed it. And sometimes the people you think are going to accept the gospel, they're not the ones who do. You can't force people to believe, and you certainly can't make them love the Lord enough to submit to him. You just can't. You can point them to the information they need to make the right choice. But they have to make that choice for themselves. You see, to acknowledge the evidence about Christ means that changes have to be made, always. Nobody's in a position to learn about Jesus and to come to terms with who he is and what he taught and to say, I'm pretty good. It's not how that's going to work. There is always going to be something where we say, you know what, this doesn't fit. This doesn't fit with being a follower of Jesus. And truth is, far too often people are too comfortable with their chosen lifestyle to let the demands of Christ get in the way. I'll do anything but change. And if it comes to that point, I don't follow Jesus anymore. To decide that Jesus is who he claimed to be means that the old life has to be forsaken. And so that conclusion, so many times, is just firmly resisted. One thing that may be implied in this passage is that there comes a time when Jesus gives up on those who simply refuse to accept him. As far as I know, this was the last time that Jesus stepped foot in the city of Nazareth. And as I mentioned earlier, Jesus went to Nazareth as a preacher one time before this, and early on during the period of his preaching in Galilee, that was the case. And they rejected him. Again, they wanted to kill him, tried to throw him off a cliff. And Jesus gave them another opportunity on this occasion, and this takes place toward the end of his preaching in Galilee. And when they rejected him again, he left Nazareth. And he continued preaching. He just did it in other places. And there wasn't a whole lot more he could do for them. His work was to continue with or without the recognition of the people of Nazareth. But the loss was theirs. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And the fact is that's not dependent upon people recognizing him as such or submitting to him as a result of that. When people fail to do that, that is their loss. And doesn't it make more sense for us to simply accept him for who he is and all that is implied in that? And so the question for you this evening is this: have you submitted your will to his? Don't be among those who had more than enough evidence about the identity of Jesus, but who chose not to believe, who chose not to obey. If you're here tonight, you've never responded to the gospel of Christ, what would keep you from doing that? Why not submit to him? And if there's some way that we can help you, whether it is with obeying the gospel of Christ or bringing some aspect of your life into keeping with his will, you let us do that? That's why we come together, one of the reasons at least. And we want to encourage you as we stand and as we sing.
I hear